Hello, in today's prayer vignette, we want to talk about prayers of confession. Prayers of confession are a hard thing for us because we don't like to admit our faults. We find it difficult to acknowledge the ways we've sinned, the ways we are broken, the ways we're unsure. We sometimes find this difficult to know how to talk to God about those things. Again, sometimes we feel in a sense of arrogance that there's nothing wrong with us. And other times we feel just crushed by the weight and the burden of our sin and so ashamed to try and get close to God. And so today we want to talk a little bit about prayers of confession. Let's start off with the sins that we know about. The sins in our lives that we're wrestling with, that we're struggling with, that we really recognize, the ways that we feel the sense of the burden and the weight of the impact and the guilt of these things. In Psalm 51, David is in this kind of space where he's committed a terrible couple of sins, and he's really feeling the burden. He prays like this: "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all of my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." Then he goes on to say, "Create in me a pure heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me." And I think with these areas of sin, where we recognize what they are, where we feel the weight of these things, we want to follow this kind of pattern. We want to just be open and acknowledge these things to God and say, "Lord, I recognize this is my sin." Name it specifically and say, "Lord, this is the evil that I have done. Would you cleanse me? Would you forgive me? Would you wash me clean?" And just pursue him in these particular spaces. Ask him to make us right, to make us whole and steadfast at the core of our being. In David's prayer, there's a particular sense that he wants to change. It's not just the kind of confession where you say, "Oh Lord, forgive me," and then we go back to doing exactly the same thing. We're saying, "Lord, would you forgive me? And Lord, would you change me all the way down and all the way through? Would you give me a steadfastness to my soul that I would pursue you and follow you?" And as we do this, it can be a good practice to ask God, is there anything in particular you're asking me to change? Sometimes he invites us to confess our sin to someone else. Sometimes he asks us to change the way that we interact with this particular part of our lives. Sometimes he just wants to affirm his forgiveness to us. And so again, if you have sins that you know about, things that you're wrestling with, maybe perpetual sins that you're struggling with, it's good just to take a few moments to just sit in the presence of God, to acknowledge these sins, to confess them to him, to turn away from these things and ask God to give you everything that you need to find freedom. Again, sometimes that comes in a moment, and sometimes that is a journey and a process to work through. But then there's other areas of sin. There's areas of sin in our lives that we are sometimes blind to. Sometimes because we have deceived ourselves. Sometimes because our society is so immersed in these kinds of sins that we don't really recognize them. Again, it could be materialism. We know we live in a society where it's all about pursuing more and getting more. And again, there's a profound evil in that. And sometimes we need the Holy Spirit to point out to us what are the particular elements of sin that we don't really recognize. And in this kind of space, I love using the words of Psalm 139. In the last couple of verses of Psalm 139, the psalmist says this: "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." And it can be a really healthy thing on an ongoing basis to just sit down in the presence of God and say, "Lord, what is there in my life? Would you search me, Holy Spirit? Would you know me? Would you show me every wicked, every anxious, every offensive way in the core of my being?" And as he points out particular aspects of sin, just confess those things to God. And then ask him to lead you in the way everlasting. Ask him to help you to grow and to change, to find freedom from these things. Again, sometimes it's surprising. Sometimes we didn't realize that we were offending God or sinning against him in these ways. And we just need that space to just sit and say, "God, would you show me what I need to work through?" Again, these are things that are important that I find are helpful on both levels. In the areas of my sin that I recognize and know about, and the areas that I don't yet recognize or don't yet understand. I need the Holy Spirit to show me these things. So today what I'd like to encourage you to do is just take some time and just confess to God. Just be open and honest with him. Sit down with him and take the sins that you know about and say, "Lord, I confess these things to you. Would you forgive me and cleanse me? Would you lead me in the way everlasting? Is there any aspect of change that you are asking me to play an active role in, to bring about a real shift in my soul from these things?" And also, I think it's really important for all of us to just sometimes sit in the presence of God and say, "Lord, would you search me? Lord, would you know me to the core? Show me everything that's wicked, everything that's anxious, everything that's offensive to you. And Lord, lead me out of this into the way everlasting. Again, the Psalms give us beautiful language to confess these things to God. And so I encourage you today and in the week to come, just spend some time in a prayer of confession, just pursuing God. God bless you.